Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be redesigning Robecca Steam. So, starting off, I am just sketching out her body type. I wanted her to be very lanky in a sort of inhuman way, with very sort of like exaggerated, sort of like a very thin waist to sort of emphasize that there's no internal organs in there and that she's very robotic. My inspiration board had a lot of inspiration from robots that are generally sort of like antiquated looking, like the idea of the killer robot of the 50s, and taking inspiration from the first movie robot of Maria from Metropolis. So I was definitely taking inspiration of her sort of like head crown and the like way her features are sculpted, since she's very humanoid compared to the more sort of clunky look of the robotics of the 50s. So I wanted to sort of take notes from those. In terms of aesthetic and style, I have on the mood board inspiration from vintage sort of superheroes with jetpacks, roller derby, steampunk, Amelia Earhart, all sorts of different inspirations there. So for this first look here, I wanted to go with a big clunky jetpack and a very tight sort of aviator hat to keep her hair sort of pinned down, and I wanted to make that in an aviator jacket while going with a sort of roller derby-esque skirt and boots that mimic her original iconic rocket boots, which I always thought were really cool in terms of her design. Then I wanted to go ahead and sketch out the idea I had here for having her eyes sort of be her goggles and have them be little like screens with the sort of almost heart monitor-esque shape that sort of darts around on them, little waveforms, just as a way to reinforce the fact that she is a robot. I thought that'd be a fun way to do that. For the second look, since the first look was very sort of like streamlined, I wanted to go very poofy on the next one, taking a lot of inspiration from more traditional steampunk aspects with a sort of faux corset on her waistline, a poofy skirt with layers, and some roller derby fishnets to try to blend those two aesthetics together, since I always thought it was really cool as a kid that she was into roller derby, and I really liked that she was like sporty. So I definitely wanted to keep that through line in her design reading here. For the next look, I wanted to play around with having her hair, instead of being sort of natural and loose curls, having it form into some dreadlocks, and head casing that Maria crown again with the goggles on top of her head instead of being the eyes like were in the previous designs. So I did this sort of button up sort of like spaghetti strap with a little peplum flare and some sweatpants, and of course knee pads, safety first. For the fourth look, I really liked how this one came together. It's kind of sort of the baseline of what I ended up going in the final design, where I had the idea of her hair being short and textured, and with these two big antennas coming out of where her ears would be, again to sort of reinforce the aspect of her being robotic itself, because the original Robecca design definitely has a lot of robotic influences in terms of her like outfit. There's lots of gears and such on both her body and her accessories, but I sort of wanted to take the idea of Gen 1 Rebecca's goggles and sort of just fuse them and make it Rebecca herself. And then for my final redesign look here, I wanted to go with a big chunky braid made of micro braids, and again focus a little bit more on the steampunk aesthetic and have it be almost sort of academic looking. So instead of goggles, there'd be glasses, a little hat on top of some kind, and of course the sort of very typical, or at least stereotypical, steampunk sort of like cage skirt, but being outside so you can see the structure of it. I also wanted to go back to the knee pads idea, but make them sort of more bolt looking to, again, hammer home the robotic sense to her design. Then I'm just going ahead and writing out my favorite parts of each of the little designs, so that way I can then draw out my final redesign, taking aspects from everything. So starting off, I wanted to go with those ear antennae and the molded on goggles for her eyes instead, to push the robotic aspect, as well as incorporating that sort of halo of little electrical doodads from Maria. And I wanted to have her still keep the aviator cap in reference to Amelia Earhart and steampunk, but I wanted it to be sort of cut so that way in the back she has a big poof of mad science-y curls coming out from the back. I also wanted her to have a necktie, and I wanted to keep the aviator jacket but modify it so it was a little bit more of a mixture of the sort of steampunk Victorian aesthetic. So it has the practical aspects of being made of leather, slits for extra movement, and elbow pads, as well as having peplum at the waist and these big poofy shoulders. And keeping with the mix between practical and aesthetic, I wanted her to have this sort of open skirt, these big tiered layers to keep that very Victorian steampunk aesthetic going, with the cage of like gears and wood, but I also wanted her to have some shorts underneath it, and again, to tie back to the roller derby, keep with that stripe motif of the fingernail glove on her hand and adding it into pinstripes on the shorts, so it sort of blends the two aesthetics together. I also wanted her to have knee pads, but making them bolt-shaped, and of course I had to keep her rocket boots, but modifying them in a way that is a little bit shorter, so you see more of the leg that has... I wanted to keep these little like stripy socks, but I ended up changing my mind in having it instead just be fishnets underneath, so that way it's not too many clashing stripes in different directions. So moving on to the color thumbnailing here, I wanted to sort of stick with her original color palette because I really liked all that bronze, and one thing that I am adding is that ever since I was a kid I always had it in my mind that like Robecca has the association between wires in the colors of red, orange, and yellow to sort of make it flame, when that is not in any of her original designs as far as I'm aware, thinking back, but that was just something that I had ingrained in my head, so that's what I wanted to go with here. And you'll see I ended up adding wings instead of a jetpack, so they're very sort of like steampunk, where they're just bare bones, wouldn't really help in any discernible way, but they're aesthetic and they look cool, so they're helping somehow. I also wanted to add a little mini corset, and just to add some details, I ended up giving her a little sort of pocket chain hanging out of her waistcoat there. So just going ahead and filling out the flats for her skin, and later on I'm going to go back and add some more detail there. Another thing I ended up adding later on was to her shoes. I wanted there to be a little battery pack connecting the wires to the screw-shaped heel that then shoots out the flames for her rocket boots. And another inspiration that I wanted to take from this to add to her design were these Victorian roller skates that I saw, and so I wanted to sort of mimic the silhouette of that for her shoes. So I'm adding a lot of gold and bronze into her design and lots of red to keep everything sort of in that red, orange, yellow area with little hints of blue and dark bluish black to sort of give contrast to that. I wasn't sure exactly what color her goggle eyes should be, so I did end up coloring those last, but this piece overall ended up taking me 4 hours, 22 minutes, and 5 seconds, not including all the time for sketching and line work traditionally. And that is one of the longest times that it's taken. I think it's in 3rd place, behind Torlai, which took me 2nd longest because there was just a lot of greebling on her design, and Laguna, which took me the longest, probably because she was the very first redesign I did, and I was still sort of getting the hang of screen recording all that, so that's probably why there was a lot of extra time there. So now I'm moving on to doing the flats for all the bluish colors. I was very excited to go with this like electric blue. I thought it, pushed the electric idea, although she is steam powered. I always felt like she was sort of a mixture of the two. The same way steampunk is sort of a blending of vintage aesthetics and modern aesthetics, and mimics her storyline as someone who sort of got shot into the future. Moving back to the skirt, I wanted to add this sort of blueprint, sort of square shape to her ruffles on the skirt layers to sort of mimic the invention blueprint sort of look. And also add some contrast to the just blue and black stripes throughout her outfit, so there's also sort of blue and off-white stripes, since off-white is sort of a go-to for a lot of vintage styles. So I definitely wanted to incorporate that here between the ruffles of her dress and the ruffles of her neck shirt. I also wanted to add wiring in between the sort of spines of the wings, make them look almost bat-like, which is always very Monster High-esque. And of course, since it's steampunk, you have to add a bunch of pointless gears everywhere. I also did want to keep the little gears that spun on the back of her calves, since that was always just a really fun little tactile detail for a doll to have. I'm really happy with how her flats came out, and it felt like it took a really long time to get her flats done, but in contrast, it felt like the shading went really, really quickly. So here now I'm going ahead and adding detail to the skin. I wanted to keep with the original sort of molded aspects of her design, but I also wanted to go through and add the rivet details and have them be highlighted in gold so they stand out a little bit more. I always interpret it as a kid as sort of like the human corollary to like acne or keratosis pilaris. It was really fun adding all this detail, but it definitely did take a lot of time. And that is reflected in the final time, and also I feel like overall this is maybe one of my most complex redesigns to date, just in my opinion. Another thing I wanted to focus on in this redesign is that going forward and lately I definitely want to focus more on doing intentional silhouette work. So she has the antenna and the big wings and a lot of sort of cutouts in her design. Because usually I feel like I just sort of stumble into having different aesthetics, or I do different aesthetics purposefully, which leads to them having different silhouettes unintentionally, more like second thought. And for her design and moving forward, I want to focus on the shapes that her outfit created very intentionally. So after all of that flat work, I was very excited to finally get to the shading part. And first things first, I definitely wanted to start off by getting to all the metallic shines on her skin. And I definitely had a lot of fun doing this. It was sort of like a payoff. I also got to do a lot of wood texture, which is one of my favorite things to paint because it's very free form. So I was adding wood texture on her wings and the hip cage to add that sort of rustic look to her steampunk design. I wanted to keep all of the highlights very prominent in this piece to keep it looking very metallic and really honing in on that robot aesthetic. I also wanted to go ahead and then add some red shading to the lowlights and then use gold for the highlights to create that sort of contrast and keep it in that red, orange, yellow color scheme. And for the cool tones, using pretty much only that electric blue monochromatically to have it contrast and create a sort of subtle orange-blue complementary color scheme. Had a little bit of trouble figuring out how to shade the stripes here because I was accidentally shading beneath the layer, so I was like, why is it not showing up? That's why. For the silver, I ended up having it be sort of an almost pale purple color to sort of marry the orange and the blue in between those two hues. Then for the off-white, I'm adding some warm undertones to keep that sort of natural, almost linen sort of look to it. There were just so many little bits and bobs. This piece ended up having, I think, 24 different layers by the end of it, which is, at least by my recollection, a lot more than usual for me. I tend to just use layers as many as I need them, and a lot of layers were needed for this piece because there was just so much detail in it. I definitely got a little bit lost in the greebling. I don't know if this would be possible at doll scale, but I'm just designing these for fun. Because I like doing it. Because I like Monster High. So here I'm just going ahead and adjusting all the colors of everything before we finally get to doing the background pretty soon. I ended up also changing the cornflower blue that I had selected for the skirt layers and making it a little bit more closer to the electric blue of the color palette. So for the background image here, I'm using a little powerhouse that is part of the CU Boulder campus that I walked by one night and took a picture through the fence, and adding a sort of like sepia color tone to it so it's a bit more monochromatic and doesn't take more precedence than looking at all of the details of my Robecca redesign. So now just adding the finishing little sparkles, and then finally here is the reveal. I'm really happy with how she turned out. I especially love the bronze and gold of the color scheme and how much that electric blue just pops out in terms of her design and draws your attention to her head. I really, really love all the robotic details I added. I especially love how all the rivets on her hands look. I think it looks almost sort of love-like. I also really like the little detail of the watch that she's wearing, since she has that detail where she's always a bit late. So I imagine her always wearing a watch to compensate for that. I just love how many little details and references I was able to fit into her design. Then moving on to comparison, here is my redesign next to Generation 1 Robecca, which, isn't it kind of weird how she's only appeared in one generation? Bring her in, bring her back. She's one of my favorites and she always has been. As always, my designs are always hyper-saturated and hyper-greebled compared to the originals, but I feel like it still sort of captures the same essence that G1 has, and I'm really happy with how these two look together. I also didn't realize how sort of like sleek and streamlined G1 Robecca's design really was, especially compared to how much detail and how extravagant and flamboyant the silhouette of my redesign ended up being. Then moving on to the group images of my lineups, I'm so happy to finally have these three together. They were always like one of my favorite lines and were released at the same time I sort of started collecting as well. So it's really fun seeing these three together. They have a lot of childhood nostalgia to me, so it's very like, hooray, yippee, seeing them together. I really like how their 3 color palettes are distinct and their aesthetics are so different, and I feel like they look really good and cohesive together. So I'm just really happy seeing these 3. So here's my final redesign again. I'm really happy with how she turned out, but be sure to let me know what you think in the comments down below. Next month is going to be an Elizabeth redesign, and then in February is going to be my big yearly February video, so keep an eye out for that one coming then. Be sure to follow me on my art Instagram. I'm no longer using Twitter or X. I just wasn't getting a lot of traction there, and I like the formatting of Instagram a lot better. So be sure to follow me there, where I post art at least 3 times a month, and I often post little doodles and extras on my stories. So I will see you in the next one. Bye!